There was something comforting about the hum of fluorescent lights, the way they buzzed, steady and low, breaking the silence that blanketed the small convenience store. That was until the quiet nights turned wrong. I worked the night shift at Marty's Mart, a little place nestled off the highway where truckers pulled in for coffee and locals straggled in for smokes. It was mostly quiet. I stocked shelves, cleaned up, and maybe sold a couple of lotto tickets. I preferred it that way. I never got on well with people, and the customers were all half asleep anyhow. That night was a Tuesday just after 2 a.m., and the store was empty. I'd spent the last hour organizing a shelf of canned goods, listening to the buzz of the lights, when the bell above the door chimed. I looked up, expecting to see the usual, a tired, bleary-eyed trucker, maybe a teenager sneaking out to grab snacks, but what I saw was a man, tall and still, with a face that seemed almost stretched. His clothes looked like they'd been put on wrong, like every button was a little off, and he walked with a strange, lurching gait. "Good evening," I said, trying not to stare as he drifted toward the aisle, his head snapping toward me with wide, unblinking eyes. He didn't respond. He just stared at me, lips pulling back into an unsettling smile that didn't reach his eyes. Those eyes, they looked wrong, hollow. I felt a chill roll up my spine as he stepped closer. He didn't pick up anything, just floated around the store in slow, exaggerated movements, his limbs seeming to bend in ways that didn't make sense. He went from one aisle to the next, not buying anything, just watching. My fingers twitched near the button beneath the counter, the one we were supposed to hit if things got dicey, but I told myself not to overreact. Maybe he was just some poor guy on drugs, a little too spaced out to act normal. But every time I glanced his way, I felt his eyes burrowing into me, like he could see something in me I didn't want him to. I tried to ignore it, turning my attention back to the register. But the silence grew thick, choking, and then I heard it. A low, rasping whisper that seemed to claw out of the shadows. "Do you see them too?" he asked, his voice like nails scraping against gravel. I froze. He was standing just a few feet away, looking at something past me, his eyes wide and vacant. Sorry?" I stammered, barely able to get the words out. He pointed a shaking, twisted finger toward the security mirror at the back of the store. My heart pounded as I followed his gaze. And then I saw it. A face, pale and gaunt, peered from the edge of the mirror, half hidden in shadows. I blinked, and it was gone. A trick of the light, I told myself, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I'd really seen something. "Do you see them too?" he repeated, his eyes never leaving the mirror. I felt a cold sweat break out on my forehead, and I forced myself to laugh, trying to keep my voice steady. "Look, man, I think you might need to get some sleep. Maybe lay off the weird movies, huh?" But he just shook his head slowly, a smile pulling at his lips again, stretching them into a grotesque line. "They like it here. They like you," he whispered, tilting his head as if listening to something just out of earshot. Something was off about him, something that didn't fit, like he wasn't just some guy at all, but something far stranger. I took a step back, trying to get to the emergency button without making it obvious, my hand shaking as I reached beneath the counter. But before I could press it, the lights flickered. I let out a shaky breath, glancing up as the fluorescence buzzed and dimmed, the whole store briefly plunging into darkness before the lights came back, only softer, weaker. The man was still there, but something had changed. His eyes weren't hollow anymore. They were empty, pitch-black voids, darker than the shadows gathering in the aisles. "Do you see them now?" he whispered, his voice warped and deep, something inhuman twisting his words. I backed away, my heart slamming against my ribs. "Look, man, if this is a joke, it's not funny. You need to leave." But he didn't move. He just smiled wider, his face stretching, distorting, until it looked like his skin might tear apart. And then I heard footsteps, slow, dragging footsteps that echoed from somewhere beyond the aisles. I glanced at the security mirror again and nearly screamed. There were shapes moving in the reflections, figures with eyes as black as his, mouths open in silent screams. They shambled down the aisles, their bodies twitching and contorting, their faces twisted into grotesque, horrific smiles. They were getting closer. I bolted for the exit, my pulse racing, but the door wouldn't budge. It was locked. And then I heard the man's voice, soft and too close, right behind me. "You can't leave," he whispered, his breath cold against my neck. "Not until they're done with you." I whirled around, but he was gone. I was alone in the store, except for the shapes moving toward me, one by one, stepping out of the mirrors, their hands reaching, fingers too long, too sharp, stretching toward me. "Help," I whispered, knowing no one could hear me, and then the lights went out completely. In the dark, I could feel them, their hands brushing against me, ice cold and clawed. They were everywhere, whispering, laughing in raspy, broken voices, pressing close, surrounding me. One of them leaned in, its breath rattling against my ear. "We've been watching you for so long," it hissed, its voice twisted with malice. "Now it's time." I tried to scream, but my voice was gone, choked by the icy terror that had taken over me. I felt the walls closing in, the darkness swallowing me whole, and then, just as quickly as they'd appeared, they were gone. The lights flickered back on, and I was standing alone in the aisle, gasping for breath. The store was empty, the aisles silent, everything just as it had been. I staggered back to the counter, my hands shaking as I tried to catch my breath. I glanced up at the security mirror, my heart still pounding, half expecting to see them staring back at me. But there was nothing, except for one last thing. Etched into the glass, in faint, white scratches, were 4 words that made my blood run cold. "We'll see you soon." I quit that night, left without looking back. But sometimes, I catch a glimpse in my rearview mirror, a shadow just out of sight, a whisper I can't quite make out. And I know they're still watching. I'd always thought being a paramedic was tough. People think of the physical demands, the trauma, but there's something else that digs deep, a gnawing feeling that stays with you. The incident that haunts me happened during a night shift, somewhere around 3 a.m. My partner, Casey, and I had just wrapped up a call, exhausted and driving back, when the radio buzzed. Dispatch came through, possible suicide attempt, location near an old farmhouse, suspect male, age 25. A deep sigh settled between Casey and me. But that's the job. We took the call and followed the directions, winding down empty roads through endless fields as the fog thickened around us. I remember the quiet, so quiet you could almost hear your own thoughts in the mist. Finally, we reached the location. It was an old farmhouse, all right, looming out of the fog, sagging under the weight of neglect. The light above the porch was flickering, a cold glow that barely pierced the mist. There were no other lights around, no other signs of life, just a battered wooden door hanging on its hinges. Casey and I exchanged glances, an unspoken tension settling between us. We knew to be careful. People could be unpredictable, and from what we'd heard over dispatch, this call didn't sound routine. The silence felt heavy, pressing down on us as we climbed the porch steps. Casey gave the door a light knock. "EMS," she called, her voice firm but cautious. No response. "Maybe we should just check," I whispered, glancing toward the window, though it was dark inside. Casey shrugged, and with a gentle nudge, the door creaked open. I remember that creak, drawn out and hollow, almost like a warning. Inside, the house was strange. The air felt thick, stale, like it hadn't been breathed in for years. Everything was covered in dust, yet we could see faint footprints on the floor, leading down the hallway and into a room at the back of the house. "Hello?" Casey called out again, and we listened for a response, but there was only silence. We moved cautiously down the hallway, following the footprints. My pulse quickened as we reached the door to the back room. The door was ajar, and through the gap I could see someone sitting on a bed. A man, slumped forward, his back to us, his body eerily still. "Sir, we're with EMS," I said, stepping into the room. "Are you all right?" The man didn't move. Casey went ahead, approaching him slowly. As she got closer, she glanced back at me, her face pale. "He's not responding," she whispered. "I think he's gone." I followed her gaze and noticed something strange. The way he was sitting didn't seem natural, like he'd been posed. His head was angled down, arms hanging loosely by his sides, but his back was perfectly straight. I took a step closer, and that's when I saw his face. It was twisted in an expression of pure terror. His mouth was open, frozen in a scream, his eyes wide and empty, like he'd seen something horrible in his last moments. I felt bile rise in my throat, and I turned away, trying to steady myself. That's when Casey tapped my shoulder, her face frozen in fear. She pointed to the wall opposite us, where a single phrase had been scratched deep into the wood. "Don't look at her." A chill ran down my spine as I looked back at the man, his face contorted, his eyes fixed on something just behind us. Who's her?" I whispered, my voice barely audible. As if on cue, I heard it. A faint, rasping breath, coming from somewhere in the room. My heart raced as I scanned the shadows, but there was nothing there, just darkness. Then the breath again, louder, closer, almost right beside me. Casey and I locked eyes, and I could see her fear mirrored in my own. She motioned toward the door, and we both started to back away, but something in the room shifted. It felt like the temperature dropped, like the air itself had become thicker, harder to breathe. And then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw movement. At first, it was just a shadow, a slight blur in the periphery of my vision. But as I turned, it took form. There was a figure, tall and thin, cloaked in shadows, standing just behind the man on the bed. She, if it was even a she, was facing us, her face obscured, but I could feel her eyes on me, boring into me, freezing me in place. Casey grabbed my arm, and I snapped back, stumbling as she dragged me toward the door. We raced down the hallway, our footsteps echoing, but no matter how fast we ran, the house seemed to stretch, like we were moving through thick, dark water. And all the while, I could hear it, that rasping breath following us, growing closer. We burst through the front door, nearly tripping over each other as we stumbled outside. The fog had thickened, swallowing the landscape, but we didn't stop running until we reached the ambulance. Inside, we sat in silence, both of us gasping for air, our hearts racing. I glanced back at the house, its dark, empty windows staring back at us, like eyes watching, waiting. We called it in, waited until backup arrived, and they searched the house. They found the man, confirmed he was gone, but they didn't find anything else. No figure, no strange writing on the walls. Nothing, just an empty house with a dead man. They ruled it as suicide. But I knew better. I remember that face, frozen in horror, and the message scratched into the wall. We never spoke of it again, not in detail. But sometimes, late at night, I still feel that same presence, like something's there, watching, waiting. I haven't worked a night shift since, but I still see her sometimes, in dark reflections, in shadows just out of reach. And each time I remember the words, "Don't look at her." I took a job as a night guard at Halbrook's Antiques, an odd little store in a rundown part of town. The pay was decent, but the store had a reputation for being strange. It'd been around for over 100 years, they said, though no one remembered who started it. Every old object you could imagine filled that place, from Victorian dolls to rusty surgical tools. People joked it was haunted, but I wasn't one to believe in that. My first shift was dead quiet. My only task was to sit at the front desk, monitor the cameras, and make rounds every hour. The store closed at midnight, and I'd lock up, listening to the hum of the fluorescent lights and the occasional groan of the old wood settling. I expected boredom, maybe a little creepiness, but nothing like what I got. It was around 2 a.m., and I was just about to take my round when I heard it. A faint scratching, like nails dragging across wood. I froze, thinking maybe a raccoon had gotten in. But then it stopped, replaced by a soft shuffling, as if something were moving us the creaky floorboards in the back of the store. "Hello?" I called, half expecting to see some kid who'd snuck in. Silence. Just the stale, musty smell of dust and old wood. Gripping my flashlight, I walked toward the back, heart pounding. The scratching resumed, louder this time, coming from the far wall lined with an odd collection. Dusty dolls, old photographs in cracked frames, and tarnished mirrors. The beam of my flashlight danced across the room, and I nearly jumped when it landed on a life-sized porcelain doll sitting in a rocking chair. Its face was cracked, and one eye was missing, the other staring straight at me. The doll hadn't been there before. I let out a shaky breath. I didn't want to touch it, but something made me reach out, gingerly lifting the doll to see if anything was behind it. As I picked it up, a small piece of paper slipped from its lap. I unfolded it with trembling hands and read the single scrawled line, "She's watching." Chills shot up my spine. I dropped the paper and backed away, my eyes scanning the room. But nothing seemed out of place, except now the mirrors were facing me. I was sure they had been turned the other way. They reflected the rows of eerie, unblinking dolls, each with an expression that seemed just a little too lifelike. I thought I saw movement in one of the mirrors, just a flicker. But when I looked again, it was gone. I took a deep breath, trying to steady myself. It was just a long night shift, I told myself, and the darkness and silence were playing tricks on me. But the scratching sound came again, louder, closer. I swung the flashlight around, its beam landing on the far wall where a large, old wardrobe stood. Its door was slightly ajar, and the scratching seemed to be coming from inside. Every instinct told me to walk away, but curiosity got the better of me. I took a step forward, then another, until I was right in front of it. "Hello?" I whispered, not even sure what I was expecting, and then I heard it. A whisper, faint and rasping, coming from inside. "Help me!" My heart pounded so loudly I thought it might burst. I felt like I was in a trance as I reached for the wardrobe handle, my hand trembling. I yanked it open, shining my flashlight inside. Nothing. Just a dark, empty wardrobe, the smell of mold thick and overpowering. I let out a shaky laugh, relieved, but then I noticed something etched into the back of the wardrobe. It was a small, carved figure, a girl, her mouth open, her hands raised as if scratching at the door. My skin prickled as I traced the figure with my flashlight, realizing that her expression looked just like the doll's. I slammed the wardrobe shut and backed away, heart racing. I turned to leave, but the floor groaned behind me. I spun around and my flashlight flickered, casting eerie shadows across the room. I felt a cold draft as if something were brushing past me, and then I saw it in the mirror. A shadowy figure, just out of focus, standing directly behind me. "Help me," it whispered again, and this time it was loud, echoing through the room. I whipped around, but there was no one there. Just the rows of dolls, their eyes seeming to follow me, their lips pulled into faint, unsettling smiles. I bolted back to the front desk, barely able to breathe. I didn't care about the job or the paycheck. I just wanted out. But when I reached the front door, it was locked. I fumbled with my keys, my hands shaking, but none of them fit the lock. And then the scratching started again. It came from all around me, growing louder, and I could hear faint whispers, overlapping, too many voices to count. "She's watching. She's waiting." The lights flickered, casting shadows across the room, and then I saw her. A small, shadowy figure, crouched in the far corner, her face hidden in darkness. She was watching me, her head cocked, her eyes glinting in the dim light. "Help me," she whispered, her voice soft but filled with desperation. I backed against the door, my heart hammering, as she crawled closer, her movements jerky and unnatural, like something was pushing her forward against her will. Her face became clear as she moved closer, pale, hollow eyes, a mouth twisted into a scream. I closed my eyes, hoping it was a nightmare, but when I opened them, she was right in front of me, her face inches from mine, her cold breath brushing against my skin. "Stay with me," she rasped, her voice a low, twisted whimper. "Forever." I screamed, my body frozen as her hand reached out, icy fingers brushing my cheek, and then everything went dark. I woke up in the hospital 2 days later, the doctors telling me I'd been in the store, passed out on the floor. They said it was dehydration, maybe exhaustion, but I knew what I'd seen. I knew she was real. I never went back to Halbrook's Antiques. I heard it close down a few months later, the owner saying they'd had too many problems. But every now and then, when I'm alone at night, I hear the scratching, faint and distant, and I feel a cold breath on my neck. She's still watching. When I took the job as a park ranger, everyone warned me about night duty. I thought it was a joke at first, one of those initiation things. They'd tell me that I'd hear them after dark, that I'd see things I couldn't explain. I laughed it off, until I actually got assigned my first night shift. The park was huge, sprawling miles and miles of dense woods, old campgrounds, and trails that led to abandoned cabins. I was given the North Station, miles from any real town. The shift was from midnight until sunrise, and my only duty was to make sure nobody was camping out illegally. It was a little after 2 a.m., and I was patrolling the main trail when I heard it, a faint whistle. At first, I thought it might be the wind, but it was too distinct, too deliberate. I paused, listening, but all I could hear was the rustling of leaves in the trees, their branches swaying in the dark. The whistle came again, softer this time, like it was coming from deeper in the woods. I stood still, flashlight in hand, scanning the trees. "Hello?" I called, my voice barely more than a whisper. No answer. I figured it was probably some kid playing a prank, so I started walking toward the sound. The trail was pitch dark, the kind of blackness that swallows the beam of a flashlight. My boots crunched on the gravel, each step louder than the last, echoing through the trees. The whistling continued, pulling me deeper into the woods. But something about it didn't seem right. It wasn't random. It was almost like a tune, a haunting, lilting melody that seemed familiar, but just out of reach, like something I'd heard in a dream. "Hey!" I shouted, my voice bouncing off the trees. "Park's closed. You need to leave." Silence, only the soft rustle of leaves and the distant hoot of an owl. And then, just as I was about to turn back, I heard it, a faint, breathy voice just beyond the reach of my flashlight. "Come closer." My blood ran cold, and I froze. The voice was soft, almost a whisper, but it was close, too close. I couldn't see anyone, but I could feel a presence, like someone was standing just out of sight, watching me. I swallowed hard, telling myself it was just a prank, maybe a hiker lost in the woods. I shone my flashlight into the trees, but all I saw were twisted branches and shadows. My heart pounded as I took a step back, trying to keep calm. And then I saw her. At first, I thought it was just a shadow, a trick of the light. But as I squinted, I realized there was a figure standing in the trees, just beyond the trail. She was tall, her body shrouded in darkness, with long, tangled hair that fell over her face. She was standing still, almost unnaturally so, her head tilted, her eyes fixed on me. "Can I help you?" I called, my voice wavering. I wasn't sure if I wanted an answer. She didn't move, didn't speak. She just stood there, her face hidden in shadow, her head tilted in a way that made her look wrong. I took a step back, my flashlight shaking in my hand. "Ma'am, you're not supposed to be here. The park is closed." Still nothing. Just that empty, hollow stare. The whistling began again, louder this time, the same eerie melody. But now it was coming from all around me, like the trees themselves were breathing, filling the air with that haunting tune. I felt trapped, surrounded, the darkness pressing in. I glanced back down the trail, but when I looked forward again, she was gone. Just empty woods, silent and still. I exhaled, trying to steady myself. Maybe it had been my imagination, a shadow, nothing more. I was tired after all, and it was easy to see things in the dark. But just as I was about to turn back, I felt it. A hand, ice cold, resting on my shoulder. I spun around, heart pounding, but there was no one there. Just the trees, stretching tall and silent, their branches swaying in the wind. And then I heard her voice, soft and raspy, whispering from somewhere close. "Don't go." I bolted, running back down the trail as fast as I could, my flashlight bouncing in the dark. I didn't stop until I reached the ranger station, slamming the door shut behind me, gasping for breath. The silence was suffocating, the darkness outside pressing against the windows. I sat there, trying to convince myself it was just my imagination, that I'd let the shadows and silence get to me. But then I heard it again, faint and distant, drifting through the night. The whistling. I stared out the window, heart racing. And that's when I saw her. She was standing at the edge of the clearing, just beyond the trees, her figure silhouetted against the night. Her face was still hidden, but I could see her eyes now, glinting in the dark, watching me. And then slowly she raised her hand and pointed, right at me. I stumbled back, heart pounding, my hand fumbling for my radio. "Base, this is North Station. I need backup, now." Silence, and then a faint crackle, followed by static, and then a voice. Her voice, echoing through the radio, soft and chilling. "Come closer." I dropped the radio, my blood running cold, and backed away, my eyes fixed on the window. But when I looked again, she was gone. Just an empty clearing, silent and still. I didn't finish the shift. I left the park that night, drove until the sun came up, and never went back. I quit the next day, and I haven't set foot in those woods since. But sometimes, late at night, when I'm alone, I hear it, the faint, haunting whistle drifting through the silence. And I know, deep down, that she's still out there, waiting, calling. And one day, she'll find me again. A few years ago, I worked the night shift at a small rural hospital. It wasn't a particularly busy place. We mostly had routine checkups, sprained ankles, and the occasional accident victim. But the graveyard shift was usually dead quiet, with only a skeleton crew in the building. One night around 3 a.m., we received a call that left us all on edge. A man had been found unconscious at a nearby campsite. The rangers said he'd been alone in his tent, no sign of injury, just lying there. Cold, pale, unresponsive. I was assigned to his room once he was admitted, tasked with keeping an eye on him while we ran some tests. When they wheeled him in, I felt uneasy. He was in his early 30s, dressed in rugged outdoor clothes, and his skin was so pale it looked almost translucent. But it was his eyes that unsettled me the most. They were wide open, staring blankly up at the ceiling, but they seemed wrong. It was like he was looking at something I couldn't see, something above him or maybe through him. He didn't respond to light, touch, or sound. His heartbeat was slow but steady, his breathing shallow. I checked his pupils, but they didn't react, just stayed frozen, unfocused, staring at the ceiling. I spent the next hour monitoring him and nothing changed. Occasionally, I would get up and make my rounds, but each time I returned, he was the same, still, silent, staring. Then, around 4:15 a.m., I heard a faint rustling sound from his room. I assumed he'd finally come around, and I was relieved. But when I entered the room, I froze. The man was still lying on his back, his eyes fixed on the ceiling, but he was whispering something under his breath. His voice was so soft I had to lean in close to hear. The words were slurred, almost unintelligible, but he kept repeating them over and over. She's coming, she's here. A shiver ran down my spine as I listened. His voice sounded hollow, distant, as though he were speaking from somewhere far away. I tried to wake him, shaking his shoulder, calling his name, but he didn't respond. His gaze was still fixed on the ceiling, his eyes wide and empty. Then the lights flickered. At first, I thought it was just a power surge, but the flickering continued, on and off, faster and faster, until the entire room was filled with strobing light. I backed away, heart racing, glancing around the room. But there was no one else there, just me and the man. And then, suddenly, he sat up. I stumbled back, nearly tripping over my own feet as he turned his head slowly to face me. His eyes met mine, and in that moment, I felt a surge of cold as though I'd stepped into ice water. His face was blank, expressionless, but his eyes, there was something in them, something dark and hollow, like a void. She's here, he whispered, his voice low and raspy. She's here, and she's watching. Before I could react, he lay back down, his body going limp, his gaze returning to the ceiling. The lights stopped flickering, and the room was plunged into silence. I stood there, heart pounding, staring at him, half expecting him to sit up again. But he just lay there, unmoving, as though nothing had happened. I left the room, shaken, and went to find Dr. Nguyen, the physician on call. I told her what had happened, but she looked at me like I was crazy. When she came to check on the man, he was as still and unresponsive as before, his eyes staring blankly at the ceiling. The rest of the shift passed in a tense, eerie silence. I avoided going back to his room, choosing instead to check on my other patients. But every so often, I would pass by his door, and each time, I felt that same cold presence, like something was watching me, waiting. Around 6 a.m., the morning staff arrived, and I was more than ready to leave. As I grabbed my things and prepared to head out, Dr. Nguyen called me over. "We had a look at his records," she said, glancing at me with a concerned expression. "He's been here before." I raised an eyebrow. "Before? When?" "Last year," she said, flipping through his file. "Exact same time, exact same date." I felt a chill run down my spine. "You mean he was admitted before on the same date and he was?" "Yes," she replied, her voice barely a whisper. "Found unresponsive, alone in the woods, exact same symptoms, no response, staring up at the ceiling, whispering the same thing." I swallowed hard, the pieces falling into place in my mind. I didn't know what to say, didn't know what to think. As I walked toward the exit, I glanced back one last time at his room, and that's when I saw it. In the doorway, standing just behind the glass, was a figure. It was a woman dressed in a long, dark gown, her hair hanging over her face, her eyes fixed on me. Her lips were parted in a slight, chilling smile, her skin pale and ghostly. I blinked, and she was gone. I told myself it was a trick of the light, that I was just tired, that I'd imagined it. But as I walked out of the hospital, I couldn't shake the feeling that she was still watching, her presence lingering in the air, cold and suffocating. I never went back to that hospital after that shift. I left town, moved to the city, started working at a larger hospital where I knew there'd be people around at all hours, noise, distractions, anything to keep that memory at bay. But sometimes, late at night when I'm alone and the lights start to flicker, I hear his voice, soft and distant, whispering from the darkness. "She's coming, she's coming, she's here." I used to work nights as a security guard at an abandoned hotel on the edge of town. It was once a beautiful, grand place, full of marble staircases and chandeliers, but it had been closed for years. Rumor had it the place was haunted, but I didn't think much of it. It was just a job, and all I had to do was make rounds every hour, check the old security cameras, and keep an eye on things. It was my third night on the job, around 2 a.m., when things started to feel off. I was sitting in the guard room watching the black and white security monitors. Most of the cameras were grainy, showing empty hallways, dusty staircases, and dark, vacant rooms. The place was dead quiet, and all I could hear was the hum of the monitors and the occasional creak of the building settling. I was zoning out when I saw it on the monitor, a shadow, darting past one of the cameras on the fourth floor. I blinked, leaning closer, but it was gone before I could make out any details. I rewound the footage, but there was nothing there, just an empty hallway. I told myself it was probably a trick of the light or a bug crawling on the lens. But then it happened again, a shadow flitting across the screen, this time on the fifth floor. It was faster, harder to see, but I was sure it was there. I rewound the footage again, but once again, nothing. I felt a chill crawl up my spine as I glanced down the dark hallway outside the guard room. I decided to go check it out. After all, I told myself it was just an old building. Strange sounds and shadows were to be expected. Grabbing my flashlight, I stepped out into the hallway, the air cold and heavy. Each step echoed as I climbed the grand staircase, my footsteps the only sound in the otherwise dead silence. When I reached the fourth floor, I stopped. The hallway stretched out in front of me, empty and dark, with doors to rooms on either side. My flashlight barely cut through the thick shadows, and the air felt colder up here, like someone had left a window open. I walked slowly down the hallway, checking each door, each empty room. But as I moved, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I kept glancing over my shoulder, expecting to see someone standing there, but there was nothing, just the shadows and silence. Then I heard it, a soft whisper, barely audible, coming from down the hall. "Help me." I froze, every nerve on edge. The voice was faint, distant, but unmistakably there. I turned, shining my flashlight down the empty hallway, but there was no one there. "Hello?" I called, my voice barely more than a whisper. "Is someone there?" Silence. I took a deep breath and started walking toward the sound, my heart pounding in my chest. The whisper came again, louder this time, clearer. "Please, help me." I followed the sound to room 407, one of the old suites. The door was slightly ajar, and the faint smell of mildew and stale air drifted out. I pushed the door open, my flashlight sweeping across the room. It was empty, just a dusty bed, a cracked mirror, and peeling wallpaper. I was about to leave when I heard it again, a faint, breathy voice coming from the corner of the room. "Help me! I'm here!" I swung my flashlight toward the corner, and that's when I saw her. A woman, crouched in the corner, her hair tangled and matted, her skin pale and lifeless. Her eyes were wide and empty, fixed on something just beyond me. Her mouth was slightly open, as if she'd been frozen mid-scream, but no sound came out. I stumbled back, heart racing, but she didn't move, didn't react. She just stared, her hollow eyes following me as I backed out of the room. I slammed the door shut, my hands shaking as I fumbled with the flashlight. I ran back down the hallway, practically tripping over my own feet. I didn't stop until I was back in the guard room, breathing heavily, heart pounding. I checked the monitors, half expecting to see her on one of the screens, but the hallways were empty, the rooms dark. I sat there, trying to calm myself, telling myself it was just my imagination. But as I watched the monitors, I noticed something strange. The camera outside room 407 was flickering, the image distorted. And then, for just a moment, I saw her again. She was standing in the hallway, staring directly at the camera, her eyes wide, her mouth open in that same silent scream. She was reaching toward the camera, her hands stretched out as if trying to get closer. Then the screen went dark. The camera feed returned a moment later, but the hallway was empty. I felt a surge of cold dread, the feeling that I was no longer alone. I stayed in the guard room for the rest of the shift, refusing to make my rounds. I kept watching the monitors, waiting for her to appear again, but the rest of the night passed in tense silence. When my shift ended, I practically ran out of the building, not stopping until I was safely in my car. I quit the job the next day, unable to shake the image of her wide, empty eyes, her outstretched hand reaching toward me. I heard the hotel was torn down a few months later, but sometimes late at night when I close my eyes, I still see her face, still hear that faint, desperate whisper. "Help me. I'm here." and sometimes just before I drift off to sleep, I feel a cold hand pressing down on my shoulder. It was a job I thought would be easy. I was hired to clean out and take inventory of an old mansion on the outskirts of town. The house had been abandoned for years after the owner passed away, and they needed someone to go through and document the contents before selling it off. I was told it would take a few days, but I didn't mind. The money was good, and I liked working alone. The place was massive, a sprawling 3-story Victorian with a dozen rooms, each packed with dusty furniture, antique paintings, and shelves full of strange trinkets and old books. The first 2 days went smoothly enough. I kept busy, cataloging everything room by room. But on the third night, something changed. I had stayed late, lost in the work, and by the time I looked at the clock, it was nearly midnight. I decided to finish up one more room on the 3rd floor before calling it a night. The room was large, with a high ceiling and a grand, faded rug covering most of the floor. The walls were lined with bookshelves, but what caught my attention was a tall, ornate mirror standing in the corner, covered with a heavy, dark cloth. I hesitated, but curiosity got the better of me. I approached the mirror, gripping the cloth and slowly pulling it off. The mirror was beautiful, with a frame carved in intricate, swirling patterns that looked almost alive in the dim light. The glass was slightly warped with age, but I could still see my reflection staring back at me. I was about to turn away when I noticed something strange. In the mirror behind me, the door was open, but when I turned around, the door was closed. I stared back at the mirror, my heart beginning to race. The reflection was clear. The door behind me was slightly ajar, a sliver of darkness visible through the crack. But in reality, the door was definitely shut. I tried to tell myself it was a trick of the glass, a warped reflection caused by the age of the mirror. But as I watched, the door in the reflection slowly began to open wider. I turned back, expecting to see the door opening behind me, but it was still firmly closed. I took a step closer to the mirror, peering into the reflection. The door continued to open in the glass until it was wide open, revealing the hallway beyond. Then, a figure stepped into the reflection. My blood ran cold as I watched the figure, a tall, shadowy form with no distinct features, just a dark silhouette with faintly glowing eyes. It was standing in the hallway, watching me through the mirror. I spun around, looking back at the actual door, but there was no one there. My heart hammered as I turned back to the mirror. The figure was still there, closer now, standing just inside the room. I backed away, my breathing shallow, my eyes fixed on the mirror as the figure took another step closer. Then it whispered, in a voice so soft I could barely hear it. "Why did you wake me?" I gasped, stumbling backward. My hand brushed against the doorknob, and I yanked the door open, fleeing into the hallway. I raced down the stairs, not daring to look back, my footsteps echoing through the empty house. When I reached the front door, I grabbed the handle, but it wouldn't budge. I twisted and pulled, but it was as though the door had been locked from the outside. I frantically tried the key, but nothing worked. And then I heard it, the soft creak of footsteps coming down the stairs. I turned, my breath catching in my throat. The shadow was there, descending the staircase slowly, its eyes fixed on me. It moved deliberately, each step echoing through the house, the air growing colder with every passing second. I ran through the house, my mind racing as I tried to find another way out. Every door, every window I tried was either locked or wouldn't open, and the footsteps grew louder, closer. I finally ducked into a small storage room, slamming the door behind me. I pressed my ear against the wood, listening, trying to hold my breath. The footsteps paused just outside the door, and for a moment there was silence. Then, a soft, slow whisper came from the other side of the door. "Where are you?" The voice was barely a breath, but it was right there, just inches from where I was standing. I clamped a hand over my mouth, trying to stay perfectly still, my heart hammering in my chest. The whisper came again, more insistent. "Why did you wake me?" I backed away from the door, my hands trembling. I looked around the room, searching for anything I could use as a weapon, but there was nothing but old boxes and shelves of dusty jars. I was trapped, cornered. Suddenly, the door began to creak open. I froze, watching as the handle turned slowly, the door inching open. The room was pitch dark, and the only light came from the faint glow of the figure's eyes staring at me from the doorway. Then it stepped inside. I stumbled back, my hand hitting something solid. I turned and saw another door, a small, narrow one, almost hidden in the wall. I yanked it open and scrambled through, finding myself in a narrow staircase leading down to the basement. I had no choice. I ran down the stairs, my footsteps echoing in the tight space, the air growing colder and damper with each step. When I reached the bottom, I found myself in a small, stone room with a low ceiling and no windows. The only light came from a faint, eerie glow that seemed to emanate from the walls themselves. I heard the footsteps coming down the stairs behind me, slow and steady, each step deliberate. I backed up against the wall, heart pounding, my eyes fixed on the staircase. The shadow appeared at the top, its eyes glowing brighter, its form shifting and twisting as it descended toward me. And then I heard the whisper again, filling the room, echoing off the stone walls. "You should never have come here." The figure stepped closer, its shape dissolving and reforming, like smoke, reaching out toward me with long, shadowy fingers. The last thing I remember was the cold touch of its hand, pressing against my chest, and a final whisper, soft and deadly. "You are mine now." When I woke up, I was outside, lying on the lawn in front of the mansion. The sun was rising, casting long shadows across the empty, silent building. I stumbled to my feet, my heart racing, but the house was dark and still, as though nothing had happened. I left that day, never looking back, but I can still hear that whisper in my dreams, that voice echoing through my mind. And sometimes, when I wake up in the middle of the night, I see a shadow at the foot of my bed, watching, waiting, and I know that it's still there, waiting for me to return.